Now we can go ahead and install our Unix-based analyst machine. In theory, you could use something like Windows Subsystem for Linux to run this, and on the distribution side, you could use any other Debian-based Linux distribution that you prefer. But for our purposes, I'm going to use Ubuntu as a simple and friendly choice, specifically Ubuntu Desktop, so I can get a nice graphic-based desktop environment. The idea here is that you have some freedom of choice, and so I won't hold your hand during the lab setup. We just want an operating system that provides us with a reliable Unix environment and a shell for analysis or scripting and running the various tools that'll be central for the course. But I recommend sticking with something like Ubuntu or a closely related Debian-based distribution, since that ensures that things like the install files, the different dependencies, and the tools that we'll be using throughout the course will line up without any unexpected issues. And that way you can spend more time actually working through the material rather than troubleshooting environmental differences. And so over on the Ubuntu website, and I'll have some links referenced to here where you can get your hands on the ISO image, I'm going to go ahead and download the latest LTS or the long-term support version of Ubuntu Desktop, which in my case right now is 24.04.3. And so I just need to go over here to this download button and click on that there. And it's going to take me over to the download page where the download is going to kick off any moment now. There we go. And so it is a pretty hefty file, it's multi-gigabyte here, so give it some patience and some time so it can actually go ahead and download that ISO image, and then we can import it into our hypervisor. And so I'll just use the power of editing here once again to skip to when this download is complete. All right, and there we go. And so with this download complete and on our system, I can simply create a new virtual machine in my hypervisor and provide it this ISO image. And so the UI here really just depends on the hypervisor you're using. And so just look up how you can create a new VM from an ISO file, and it's usually pretty straightforward. And so within VirtualBox here, all I need to do is just go over to my home page if I'm not already there, and then just click on New here to create a new virtual machine. And so we can just call it whatever we want here. I'm just going to call it SOC 201-Ubuntu, just so I can reference it later on as I continue to create new VMs. And for the VM folder, this is where we're actually going to be storing the files. And so you can select whatever location you want, or you can just leave it on the default VirtualBox VMs folder, which is going to be under your user folder. And then here for the ISO image, we just need to select that Ubuntu Desktop ISO image that we downloaded. So I'll just click on Other here and go over to Download so I can find this ISO file. And there we go. And so you can see here it automatically populated some of the OS and distribution information as it was able to recognize it from the file itself. And what I'm going to do here, importantly, is uncheck this Proceed with Unattended Installation. And so we want to have an interactive installation here, otherwise we're going to run into issues. And so I'm just going to uncheck that before we continue here. And then if I open up Specify Virtual Hardware here, this is where I can actually determine how much base memory or CPUs I want to use for this system. And so again, this is entirely dependent on the amount of resources that your host machine has. And so usually if you can, try to bump up the base memory a little bit, just because this will be one of our primary systems in the lab. And so something like 4 gigabytes or more should be good enough for this system. But again, if you have the space, you'll notice here that it gives us a nice indicator of how much might be too much and when it'll start taking over our host system's resources and affecting it that way. And so try to keep it in the green here, but the more you can allocate, obviously the faster and more fluid your systems are going to be. But just also keep in mind that there will be points where we need to run multiple systems at once. And so try to keep that balance going. For CPUs, again, I'll bump this up as well, just because I have some space here. I'm actually virtualizing this environment itself, and so these aren't my actual host specifications. I'm actually running VirtualBox inside of a VirtualBox VM, and so we have some inception going on there. But anyways, once you've specified the hardware itself, we can click on Specify Virtual Hard Disk. And so this is where we're actually storing all of the files for this VM. So we're kind of creating the file system and the virtual hardware that's going to be storing that disk. You can see by default, we have it on 25 gigabytes. Try to bump that up as much as you can as well. And so anything over 50 should be fine for this VM. And we can also make sure that we leave pre-allocate full size unchecked here. And so that's going to turn it into more of a dynamic disk that will grow as our system grows. All right, and with all of that, I'll leave the rest here on the default settings and just click on Finish. And just like that, we've created our virtual machine. Now, we haven't actually installed the operating system on it, but we do have that ISO image loaded up and ready to go for when we actually kick off the virtual machine. And so that's what I'm going to do now, just by clicking on Start here, and it's going to boot up this system. And once we start up the machine, you'll notice that we're met with this bootloader window here. And so all we need to do is just keep it highlighted on Try or Install Ubuntu. And you can see we can move around the different options here with the arrow keys, but I'm going to select Try or Install Ubuntu and then click on the Enter key to select that there, and it's going to continue to start up. And we should see the Ubuntu loading screen here start up, and if we're seeing this, then we're off to a good start so far. Great, and so now we have this welcome screen, and we just need to go through this little setup wizard so we can configure our system before we actually install it. And so we just need to go through choosing the language. It's going to ask us about accessibility features, keyboard layout, just the common things. If you were to install an operating system before, you should be used to seeing most of this. For here, when it's asking what we want to do with Ubuntu, well, make sure we have Install Ubuntu selected here instead of Try, which is more of like a live version of the operating system, but we want to actually install the full operating system. So click on Next. Interactive installation is fine because we don't really have an autostart.yaml file to run here. Everything else here is just pretty much the default settings, and so I'll select default selection. Same with the recommended proprietary software. And for how we want to install the operating system, we can keep it selected on Erase Disk and Install Ubuntu. And so this is going to technically erase our virtual disk that we created. It's not going to touch your host operating system or your host disk, so don't worry about that. And now we can just create our account here. And so for the name, I'm just going to call it TCM. For the computer's name, I'll just call it SOC201 just so I can recognize it. The username as well, just leave that on TCM. Set up my password and confirm that, and then click on Next here. We can select our location information, and with that, we should be good to go. Just reviewing the choices here, making sure everything is set up okay, and click on Install. And so at this point, we kick off the long and tedious operation of installing the operating system. And so this can actually take a little bit of time, and so feel free to get up and get a coffee or go for a walk or do anything while the system files are copied over and installed. The virtual machine might restart a few times during this process as well, but if all is good, we can just leave it here and let it do its thing until we are met with the Ubuntu desktop. And so I'll just, again, use the power of editing here to speed up this process. And eventually we'll see this message here that our operating system is installed and ready to use. And so all we need to do now is just click on the Restart Now option here. And we might see this message here where it says, please remove the installation medium and press enter. Typically our hypervisor is going to handle that for us. And so all we need to do here is just hit enter and we should be good to go. And if we see the login page, then we're pretty much good to go here. I'm just going to type in my password and we'll be brought over to the desktop. Perfect. And so we have this welcome message. We can just hit next here. It's going to bother us about Ubuntu Pro. We can just skip that. We can say, no, I don't want to share data. And finally, click finish here. And there we go. Now we're over on our desktop. Now, one of the very first things I like to do when I set up a new desktop VM in VirtualBox is install the guest editions. And so if you're using VirtualBox as your hypervisor, feel free to do the same here. In VMware, I believe there's also the VMware Tools package that you can load in, and different hypervisors have different ways of adding additional functionality to your VMs. And so just think of guest editions like these set of bonus drivers or utilities that make our VM behave much more like we would expect, right? Like a normal machine. Without them, things can feel pretty slow and clunky and unintuitive, right? We can see here the screen size is just not what we would expect. Even if I were to full screen this VM, we're going to be locked at this sort of aspect ratio here. And also we don't get the beauty of copy and pasting and having a shared clipboard between our host and our VM. And so with guest editions, we get all of these things and more. And so it's a really good quality of life improvement that's absolutely worth doing. But before we can install them, the VM needs some preparation. And so I'll first just open up a terminal just by right-clicking on the desktop here and clicking Open in Terminal. And from here, I'm going to refresh Ubuntu's list of available packages just by running a sudo apt update. And then type in my password when I'm prompted, and we're just going to pull down those latest packages. Great. And so next, for guest editions to compile and install correctly, VirtualBox requires a handful of different build tools and libraries. And so I'll go ahead and install them just with another sudo apt, this time install, and then just provide the name of those packages. And so we'll have bzip2, tar, gcc, make, perl, and git. And so that's just going to go ahead and install those. When we're prompted, we can type capital Y here to say yes. And this set of packages gives us everything we need to compile and build kernel modules, because behind the scenes, guest editions is basically just a set of different kernel modules that get added into Ubuntu. And so these tools are kind of required here. One more prerequisite here is that we need to install the generic kernel headers. And so I'm just going to run a sudo apt install and then linux-headers-generic. Just like that. Just hit Y again to continue that and install. Great, and with that done, we can now go ahead and install guest editions. And so I'm going to go up to the top of my VirtualBox menu here and click on Devices, and then I'm going to go down to Insert Guest Editions CD Image and click on that. And what this is going to do, as we can see here, we have this new disk icon, is it mounted a virtual CD into our VM, which contains all the different installer files we need to run guest editions. And now back in the terminal, that installer media is going to be mounted under the media directory. So if I cd over to /media, and if I run an ls, we should see our username folder here. So in my case, it's TCM. And so I'll hop into that TCM folder. And we're going to find we have this vbox_GAs or guest editions folder here with the specific version. And so I'm just going to jump into that folder just by, I'll start typing it out and then hit tab there to autocomplete. And then if I run an ls, we're going to see a number of different files here, of which we're going to see this vbox linux editions.run file. And this is the installer file that we want to kick off here. And so what I'm going to do is just run a sudo here to run with elevated permissions, and then just / that file. And so I can just right click paste to run the vbox linux editions.run file. And once this is kicked off, it's going to go ahead and compile and install those drivers. And so while it does this, don't be too alarmed if the screen kind of changes or flashes on you, or if you see the resolution changes a few times while it runs. That's all completely normal. It just means that the new video driver is kicking in and everything's good to go. And so we'll just give this a moment to finish installing. And once we do, we're going to need to reboot our system so everything takes effect. Great, and there we go. Our screen kind of shrunk there, and that's perfectly fine. All I need to do is just run a sudo reboot here. So hopefully you can see that. It's kind of getting cut off to the next line, but a sudo reboot. And then to do so immediately, I'll just provide the now argument, just like that. And our VM is going to go ahead and reboot for us. And when the VM comes back up, we're back to our login page here. You'll hopefully notice that it's going to start to feel a bit smoother. And so at this point, I like to go up to the View tab here and click on Full Screen Mode. And then it's going to give us a little prompt here. We can just click on Switch. And there we go. We now have a full screen desktop environment as we would expect. And so I'll just sign in here once more, be taken back to my desktop. And from here, what I can also do is go down to the VirtualBox menu at the bottom and just hover over here to open it up. And then I'll click on Devices, and you can see we have, all of these different features that we can do because we have guest editions installed. And so we can turn on the shared clipboard, right? So right now it's set to disabled. I can change that over to bidirectional, so I can start to copy and paste things from my host machine into my VM and vice versa. And so whether it be specific commands that I want to copy and run inside the VM, or output from commands that I want to maybe take out of the VM onto my host to analyze or do what I need to do, or for documentation purposes, it becomes a lot easier to do now that I have a bidirectional copy and paste. You'll also notice if I go back to devices here, we can also turn on things like shared folders and set those up for our VM and our host machine, or things like drag and drop as well. And so I'm just going to keep the shared clipboard on because that's the most important in my view, and we should be good to go.